I always tell people that my story didn't begin in darkness, it began in shining gold. I was born as Princess Lalwa bint Abdul Rahman Al Sabah, a daughter of one of Kuwait's most respected and powerful royal houses. People from the outside saw only what they wanted to see: marble palaces, servants in pressed uniforms, gardens kept green even in the harshest heat, and long hallways filled with artwork brought from every corner of the world. They saw the gold. They never saw the cage. From the moment I opened my eyes, my life wasn't mine. My father, Sheikh Abdul Rahman Al Sabah, was a man who believed that honor must be guarded the way a soldier guards a border. Every step, every word, every breath of mine had to reflect the family name. I often say I was raised by rules before I was raised by love. My father made sure of that. My mother, Sheikha Maryam, was the softness in our palace. If my father was the iron gate, she was the gentle breeze that tried to slip through its cracks. She held my tiny hand when the world outside my nursery felt too large. She whispered hope into my ears when my father's expectations pressed heavily on my little shoulders. I adored her. I feared him. People imagine royal childhoods as endless celebrations and laughter. Mine was different. My days began before sunrise with tutors who bowed so low that I wondered if they ever looked up. I learned Arabic poetry before I learned to play. I memorized entire chapters of classical texts while other children were still learning to tie their shoes. By the age of 7, I was already studying in a private Islamic institution reserved only for the highest circles of our society, a place where discipline was not encouraged but demanded. At school, I was surrounded by daughters of ministers, ambassadors, and top military officers. Their abayas were stitched with the finest threads, and their fathers' names opened every door. But even among them, I was different. I was the daughter of Abdul Rahman Al Sabah, and that title alone reminded everyone that I lived under stricter rules than the rest. I remember walking into the school courtyard every morning. The girls would gather around me, not because they wanted friendship, but because they wanted connection to my family. I learned early that people approach royalty not out of love, but out of usefulness. They smiled at me with their lips, but never with their hearts. Inside the palace, the silence was beautiful and heavy. Gold chandeliers hung above my head like frozen suns. Passion carpets softened every step I took. Doors were carved with designs older than my ancestors. But none of it filled the emptiness inside me. I had everything except freedom. I had everything except myself. When I was 10, I began to understand the weight of expectations. My father started speaking to me not as a child, but as a symbol of the family legacy. Lalwa, he would say in his deep commanding voice, your life is not for you alone. You carry the honor of generations. You are a daughter of the Al Sabah lineage. Do not forget who you are. But the truth. I didn't know who I was at all. I remember standing in front of a mirror in my room one day. I wore a dress embroidered with real pearls, the dress worth more than some houses. My hair was brushed until it shone. I looked perfect by every royal standard, yet I stared at my reflection and felt absolutely empty. I wondered if anyone would ever see the girl behind the title. My mother tried her best to shield me. She would slip into my room late at night, long after my father had retired to his office to meet with advisors, and she would wrap me in her soft shawl. My precious Lalwa, she would whisper, you are more than the throne behind your name. But she could only protect me within the walls of my room. Outside those walls, my father's voice ruled every corner of our lives. He loved me in the only way he knew, through control. When I laughed too loudly, he reminded me to be dignified. When I played too freely, he told me to be calm. When I questioned anything, he demanded silence. Honor. Tradition. Discipline. Silence. These were the 4 pillars of my upbringing. The palace was always full of people, yet I felt alone. Guards at every door, maids in every hallway, chefs in every kitchen, but none of them saw me as a person. They bowed, they obeyed, they spoke only when spoken to. And I, the princess, learned to smile even when my heart felt numb. There is a strange loneliness that comes with being watched your entire life. You are never alone, yet never known. Sometimes I would sneak into the rooftop terrace at night, barefoot, letting the cool wind brush against my face. From up there, I could see the lights of Kuwait City stretching toward the horizon. Cars moved like tiny sparks. Families gathered on balconies. Children played in the street. They were free. I envied them. Inside the palace, my voice did not matter. My dreams did not matter. Even my tears had to obey rules. My father would always say, "A princess does not cry. A princess endures." So I endured. And endured. And endured. But deep inside, a quiet ache lived in me. A longing for something I couldn't name. A desire to feel seen, heard, understood. A desire for love that wasn't measured by obedience. People look at my early life and say I was blessed. They point at the wealth, the power, the respect, the silk, the jewels, the convoys waiting at our gates. But I know the truth. I was born in a palace, yet raised inside invisible chains. And even though I didn't know it then, the path ahead of me would test those chains in ways I never imagined. My story began with gold. But gold can be the heaviest burden of all. Growing up in the palace felt like growing inside a glass box. Everyone could see me, admire me, talk about me, but no one could truly touch my world or understand what lived inside my chest. As I stepped into my teenage years, people across Kuwait began to speak of me with admiration, the newspapers, the women in the markets, the noble families who attended our grand receptions. They said I was graceful, intelligent, and blessed with a rare calmness. But admiration is not the same as freedom. In fact, the more people admired me, the tighter the chains around me became. By the time I turned 17, I had grown into the woman everyone expected me to be. I was tall, with long dark hair that reached my waist, and my features carried the unmistakable stamp of the Olsabo lineage. The women of the court said my eyes held royal depth, though what they really held was a deep well of questions I was never allowed to ask. I excelled in every class. Politics, poetry, religion, economics, history. I memorized entire books simply because I had no other choice. Excellence was expected, never praised. My father would only nod and say, "Good. A daughter of mine must always be above the rest." Above the rest. Yet always beneath his command. As I reached adulthood, the boundaries around my life began to change. Before, they were invisible. Now, they were spoken clearly, like carved lines I was forbidden to cross. My father's presence became heavier in my everyday decisions. I could no longer choose my clothing freely. I could no longer choose which events I attended. And when I asked for hobbies outside my approved list, I was questioned sharply. I felt my life shrinking at the very age it was supposed to be opening. One evening, as I sat in the royal dining hall with my parents, my father spoke in a tone that made my heart tighten instantly. His voice was deep and steady, the kind that could silence a room even when he whispered. "Lalwa," he said, placing his spoon gently on the table, "you are a woman now. And a woman of our house marries not by emotion, but by duty." My mother lowered her gaze. I lowered my heartbeat. Father continued, "Marriage in our position is not personal. It is political. Your choice must strengthen our alliances. Nothing else." His words were cold, but not surprising. I had heard them my entire life in bits and pieces. But hearing them now, spoken directly to me, made them real in a way that burned my chest. I wanted to speak. To ask, what about love? To ask, what about happiness? To ask, what if I want something different? But even the questions refused to leave my lips. Years of silence had trained me well. For the next few months, my father became even more watchful. My outings with friends were reduced. The palace guards accompanied me more closely. Invitations from noble families were filtered before they reached me. Even my phone, a simple device that the rest of the world used freely, became something I handled with caution. Screens were not private in the palace, and neither were hearts. It was during this time of tightening control that something unexpected happened, something that made my own heart awaken for the first time. His name was Fahad Mohammed Al-Zaman, the son of a wealthy and respected businessman. A young man whose character was admired by ministers and whose intelligence was praised even in high circles. I met him officially at a diplomatic reception hosted in our palace. It was one of those grand evenings where every corner of the hall glowed with gold and crystal, and the air carried the scent of wood and roses. I stood beside my mother, greeting guests with polite smiles, when Fahad approached. He bowed with respect. Not exaggerated, not fearful, just sincere. And when he greeted me, his voice was warm, steady, and kind. "Princess Lalwa," he said, "it is an honor." I had been greeted by thousands of men before, but something about him made my heart shift gently, like a curtain being moved by the wind. There was a calm confidence in his eyes, the respect that did not feel forced or political. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. We spoke briefly, always within the boundaries of public conversation, but even those short exchanges stirred something inside me. He asked about my studies, praised my accomplishments, then spoke of Kuwait's future with optimism. Not many people in my world spoke of dreams. Most spoke only of power and status. Fahad spoke differently. After that night, his family visited ours for formal matters, and each time, I saw him from a distance, always dignified, always warm. And slowly, quietly, my heart began to hope for something I had never dared to imagine, a marriage that was not built solely on family alliances, but on mutual respect and genuine affection. And then, one morning, everything changed. I was in my private sitting room when my mother entered with a letter in her hand. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried a strange light, hope mixed with fear. "This is for you," she whispered, giving me the envelope. It was a formal letter from the Al-Zaman family. A marriage proposal. For me. My hands trembled so badly I could hardly hold the paper. Fahad had asked for my hand. My heart raced with a joy I was scared to feel. The thought of being with someone gentle, someone kind, someone who saw me as more than a title, it felt like sunlight for a soul that had only known shadows. But joy in my life never came alone. It always brought a warning with it. When my father received the proposal, his reaction was nothing like mine. He did not smile. He did not soften. He simply sat back in his chair, stroked his beard, and let silence fill the room. My mother stood beside him, holding her breath. I stood across from him, holding my hope. After a long moment, he said, "The Al-Zaman family is respected. Their son is honorable. The proposal is acceptable, but the arrangement will be done on my terms." His terms. Always on his terms. He did not celebrate my happiness. He did not ask what I wanted. He only saw one thing, the political advantage. Still, I held on to my joy. I did not care if the approval came from a place of calculation instead of love. I cared that finally, I might have a chance at a life where someone understood me. For the first time in years, I prayed with excitement. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream. The engagement preparations went quickly. Meetings between families. Discussions. Agreements. Dates. Every detail was handled with the seriousness of a royal treaty. And as the weeks passed, Fahad and I were allowed to see each other briefly during family gatherings. Each moment with him felt like breathing fresh air after years of holding my breath. He spoke to me with care. He looked at me like a person. He listened, something my life rarely offered. And I began to believe something dangerous. That my future might actually belong to me. But happiness in the palace is fragile. And mine was not meant to last. The first sign that something wrong was forming happened one evening during a discussion between the families. The men had gathered in my father's private reception room, and I quietly passed by on my way to the garden terrace. The door was slightly open. I heard my father's voice, deep, firm, without emotion. "This marriage will not weaken my authority," he said. "If your son joins our family, he understands that decisions concerning my daughter's life will remain under my guidance." My chest tightened. Guidance. My entire life had been lived under that word, but now it was following me into my marriage. I heard Fahad's father respond politely, "Of course, Sheikh Abdul Rahman. Your honor is unquestioned, and your guidance is respected." His words sounded like agreement. Too quick. Too easy. Then came the second sign, clearer, sharper, frightening. A week later, I noticed Fahad seemed troubled. His smile was still gentle, but something behind his eyes had changed. When he greeted me, his voice carried a hesitation I had never had before. I asked quietly, "Is everything all right?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Your father has conditions regarding our marriage," he said softly. "Very heavy conditions." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What conditions?" He shook his head slightly, as if he didn't know how to explain it without hurting me. "I will speak to you when the time is right," he said. "But know this, I want to protect you. Whatever comes, I will stand beside you." His words warmed me and frightened me all at once. For the first time since our engagement, I felt fear inching into my hope. What was my father planning? What did he mean by guidance? Why was Fahad struggling with something he could not tell me? That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the lights of Kuwait City from my window. The same view that once gave me comfort now felt like a distant world I was never allowed to join. My heart whispered that something was coming. Something that would change the direction of my life forever. Something that would test every part of me, my courage, my faith, my identity. And I was right. Because the next chapter of my life did not bring freedom. It brought the first taste of real pain. A pain that would open the door to everything that followed. A pain that would reveal a truth I never wanted to see. A pain that would mark the beginning of the darkest journey of my life. If I could erase one chapter of my life, if I could tear out one memory from the book of my existence, it would be this one. This chapter still sits in my heart like a stone I cannot lift. This was the moment I learned that pain could come not from strangers, not from enemies, but from the very hand that raised me, the hand that should have protected me. It began 3 weeks after my engagement to Fahad. The palace was unusually quiet. Servants moved like shadows, their eyes lowered more than usual. My mother walked through the hallways with a worried expression that she tried, and failed, to hide. And my father, he grew colder, even toward me. His silence felt like a storm building behind closed windows. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know it would break me. One evening, my father summoned me to his private majlis, a room I always entered with careful steps. I found him sitting at the large carved table, the same table where he handled political decisions. But this time, it wasn't ministers who stood beside him. It was Fahad. My future husband. His face looked strained, like he had not slept for nights. My father gestured for me to sit. His voice was calm, too calm. "Lalwa," he said, "our family has made a decision." Decision. My whole life was shaped by that word. But this time, the air felt heavier. He continued, "For generations, our house has been protected by clear structures. Fatherly authority. Royal oversight. Power must stay within the bloodline." I looked at him, confused but attentive. Then he said the words that still echo inside me. "Your marriage will be shared." A pause. A breath that froze in my chest. "Shared between your husband and me." My heart stopped. I did not understand. I could not understand. He leaned forward and explained, his voice steady, as though he were discussing a simple rule. "When you marry Fahad, he will not act independently. Every decision he makes regarding you, regarding your home, even regarding your children one day, must pass through me. He will not hold authority over you alone. He will share that authority with me. As your father. As the head of our line. As the guardian of our family's honor." My hands turned cold. My lips trembled. I felt my world collapsing silently around me. This was not tradition. This was not culture. This was not religion. This was control shaped in the name of honor. My eyes slowly lifted to Fahad. He stood there like a man trapped between duty and despair. He did not speak. He did not defend me. His silence betrayed me more deeply than any word ever could. I whispered, my voice breaking, "Fahad, did you agree to this?" He closed his eyes. His jaw tightened. "My family has no power to refuse your father," he said quietly. "He controls matters that affect my father's business and our political standing. If I oppose him, the consequences would be damaging." Damaging. So my happiness was now a bargaining chip. My life was a tool. My marriage was a negotiation. My father nodded, proud of Fahad's obedience. "This agreement will preserve the authority of our house," he declared. "It ensures that you remain under guidance. A royal daughter does not leave her bloodline's hand. Even in marriage." I felt as if my father had taken my heart, crushed it, then placed it at his feet. Slow music plays in my memory when I recall this moment, the kind used in documentaries during scenes of heartbreak, where time slows, and the viewer feels every breath. I felt like I was watching my own life from outside my body. The room blurred. My father's voice became distant. My own breathing sounded loud, too loud. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to stand up and say, "No. I am a human being, not property. I am your daughter, not your possession." But years of silence had conditioned me. Years of obedience had softened my voice. And the weight of his power pressed against my throat. All I managed was one question, a question that cracked in my throat. "Why? Baba. Why are you doing this to me?" He looked at me, not with softness, but with firmness. "Because I love you," he replied. "Because you are my daughter. And daughters of powerful houses must remain protected. You cannot be given fully to another man. Your loyalty must stay with your father's authority." His love felt like a locked door. A door that shut me inside a life I did not choose. My mother entered the room moments later. She must have been listening outside. Her face was pale. Her eyes were wet. She rushed towards me and grabbed my hand, squeezing it, the silent apology for a pain she could not stop. But even she could not speak against my father. No one could. He continued outlining the agreement as if it were normal. Fahad would have the title of husband. But my father would have the final say in all decisions. My father would approve our home. My father would oversee major financial matters. My father would sit in on family councils. My father would decide matters concerning our children. My father would remain the primary voice of authority in my life. This was not marriage. This was a contract of domination. A structure designed to keep me tethered to him forever. Fahad lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. I never felt so alone. After the meeting, I walked out of the room in silence. The hallway outside felt colder than it had ever felt before. The guards bowed as I passed, unaware that their princess was breaking apart inside. That night, I sat in my room for hours, staring at the moon hanging over Kuwait City. I kept asking myself, how could my own father do this to me? Why does obedience matter more to him than my happiness? Is honor really worth destroying my future? Every beat of my heart felt heavy. Every thought felt like a wound. Slow music, like distant drums and strings, would fit this moment in the documentary, showing the princess alone, the camera slowly closing in on her face, tears glistening as she tries to hold herself together. Because that night, I finally broke. I tried to gather my courage and walked to my father's private courtyard. When he stepped out, I fell to my knees before him, something I had never done in my life. Please, Baba, I cried. Please don't do this. Let my marriage be mine. Let me be free. He looked down at me with a stern expression. You are asking for something that does not exist for a daughter of this house, he replied. Stand up. Do not disgrace yourself. I stayed kneeling. I begged. I begged with every part of myself. But my father turned and walked away. His final words echoed like steel. This agreement is final. And then, the door closed. The sound of that door closing felt like the sound of my destiny being sealed. I went back to my room shattered, shaking, unable to stop the tears. I felt betrayed by my father. Betrayed by Fahad. Betrayed by a system that valued my obedience over my soul. This was the moment my story took its darkest turn. This was the beginning of my life inside a shame I did not choose. And it was here, in this lowest place, that I began to whisper a prayer I never expected to say, a prayer that would one day lead me to the one who truly saves. But at this time, I didn't know that yet. For now, all I knew was pain. I still remember the lights. The way they glimmered across the marble floors of the Grand Al Sultan Palace, the way thousands of gold lanterns were arranged in spirals of glowing warmth, the way every member of my family smiled as if joy flowed through them effortlessly. They looked at me as though I were the luckiest woman in Kuwait. A bride entering a life that every girl dreamed of. A daughter whose wedding would elevate the family's honor even further. A princess whose future was already painted in victory. But no one saw the truth behind my smile. I felt as though I were walking not toward a celebration, but toward a door that would close behind me forever. The day of my wedding was a spectacle that only a royal household like mine could create. The entire palace courtyard was transformed into a paradise. Pearl fountains were arranged around the stage where I would sit. The chefs prepared platters that filled a hall large enough to host 3,000 guests. Jewelers from all over the Gulf crafted a dress for me stitched with pure gold threads. Even the air smelled of saffron and oud. People whispered my name. Princess Lalwa Al-Hamad, the jewel of the royal house, the daughter of Sheikh Abdul Rahman. They spoke of me as if I were a symbol of beauty, grace, and prosperity. If only they knew. As I stepped out of my private chamber, the ladies in waiting gasped. They praised my dress, my hair, the veil that trailed behind me. They said I looked like a queen stepping out of a dream. But inside, I felt like a girl being led toward a life that had never belonged to her. My mother stood at the far end of the hallway. Her eyes were misty, although she tried to hide it behind a soft smile. She always knew when I was hurting. She always sensed when something in my heart was trembling. As she reached out to hold my hands, I felt the warmth of the only person who had ever loved me without conditions. My daughter, she whispered, gently touching my cheek. You deserve peace. Peace. What a delicate word. What a distant idea. Before I could answer, the sound of footsteps approached. Heavy, steady, firm. My father. Sheikh Abdul Rahman Al-Hamad, the man who shaped our family's reputation with iron discipline. The man whose words were treated as law inside our household. The man who believed leadership meant ruling every soul under his roof. He approached me with pride painted across his face. But his eyes always told the real story. They watched me not as a daughter, but as something that belonged to him. Something he controlled. Something he could arrange, position, and direct however he pleased. You will smile, he ordered quietly. You will greet every guest. You will show them our strength. I nodded. I had learned long ago that questioning him was pointless. Then I was escorted toward the ceremonial hall where the wedding would be officiated. My groom, Khaled Al-Rashid, stood waiting for me. He was dressed in the traditional bisht lined with gold. His face held kindness, yet I could see the worry hiding beneath his calm expression. He knew the truth behind this union. He knew he was entering a marriage that carried a heavy shadow. When he reached out his hand toward me, I hesitated for the slightest moment. Not because I feared him, no, Khaled had always been gentle with me. I hesitated because I felt the invisible chains connecting us, chains forged by my father's authority. But I placed my hand in his, because that was the expectation. The ceremony began with grand music, the type that echoed through the palace walls like a celebration of triumph. Guests lifted their phones to capture every second. They cheered when Khaled and I exchanged vows. They clapped when I walked down the glowing carpet lined with rose petals. They congratulated us as if we were the happiest couple in Kuwait. They did not know that behind every smile I gave, there was a cry I swallowed. When the ceremony ended and the guests began to feast, I was taken to the private bridal suite, a room decorated with silk curtains and soft lights. I sat on the edge of the massive bed in my heavy dress, feeling its weight like the weight of my new life settling on my chest. Khaled entered the room slowly. He closed the door behind him and let out a breath as though he had been holding it since morning. Lalwa, he said softly, kneeling before me. I don't know how to fix this, but I swear to you, I will try to make you feel safe. His voice cracked with sincerity. And for a moment, I wished life had brought us together under different circumstances. But before I could answer, the doorknob twisted. My father stepped inside without knocking. His presence filled the room the way a storm fills the sky. Khaled immediately stood. Sheikh Abdul Rahman, we were just. I know exactly what you were doing, my father cut in, his tone sharp. You will remember that your position is tied to my approval. You will build this marriage according to my terms. Khaled lowered his head. Yes, sir. I felt something inside me tear at the sight of him, my husband, bowing under my father's authority on our wedding night. My father turned to me with a gaze that pierced straight through my chest. You will honor this agreement, he said. You will uphold our name. You will never place your husband above your father. He stepped closer. And you will never forget who holds this family together. He left as abruptly as he entered, closing the door with the soft click of a man who controlled every door in my life. Silence filled the room. My breath shook. Khaled sat beside me, placing a hesitant hand over mine. I wish I could take your pain, he whispered. I wanted to believe him. But fear stayed between us, like a wall neither of us knew how to break. That night, I cried silently under the covers while my husband stared at the ceiling, torn between two impossible loyalties. His respect for my father and his affection for me. In the following days, the palace shimmered with celebrations, but inside our private quarters, I lived in a world divided. My father visited constantly, always checking, always questioning, always making sure the agreement was being followed. I began to feel watched even when I was alone. I could not rest. I could not breathe. The luxury around me felt like a trap carrying velvet ropes instead of chains. Every morning, I woke up beside a man who cared about me, but could not protect me. Every night, I went to sleep knowing my father considered our marriage something he had the right to supervise. I felt spiritually lost. Not abandoned, just buried under expectations that left no room for breath. There were moments I stood on the palace balcony at dawn, staring at the horizon, praying silently for a way out, praying for a strength I could not name yet. The world outside saw a royal bride living her dream. But in truth, I was a lonely woman walking through rooms filled with gold while carrying a heart weighed down by fear. And with each passing day, the pressure around me grew heavier, as though the very walls of the palace were leaning closer, whispering, "You belong to us." This was the beginning of my isolation. The beginning of a marriage that was celebrated by thousands, yet felt like a prison built inside my own soul. It was during those suffocating nights, when the palace slept and the halls echoed faintly, that something inside me began to shift. A hunger for freedom. A longing for a voice. A cry that I tried desperately to keep silent. I didn't know it yet, but my journey toward truth had already begun. And soon, that quiet cry inside me would lead me toward a light I had never expected. A light that would one day save me. I used to believe that after the wedding festivities ended, the palace would finally quiet down. I imagined that perhaps, once the noise faded and the guests returned to their homes, I would find a small corner of peace, something soft, something gentle, something that would help me breathe again. But peace never came. If anything, the silence after the celebration revealed the true shape of my father's grip. It began the very next morning. I woke up before sunrise, the room still dim, the air cool. Khaled sat at the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, the heavy robe around his shoulders slipping down as though even fabric burdened him. I touched his back gently. "Did you sleep at all?" He shook his head. "Your father sent for me at dawn." "Already?" I dressed quickly and followed him downstairs, where my father waited in the reception hall. He wore his formal bisht even though no guests were visiting. He stood with his hands behind his back, chin lifted, expression unreadable. "You will come with me," he said to Khaled. "There are matters we must discuss." Matters. A word that sounded harmless but carried the weight of an entire kingdom when spoken by my father. Khaled glanced back at me, as if asking for strength. I nodded faintly. He followed my father into the council chamber, the door shutting behind them. I stood there alone, my breath shallow, my palms cold. Hours passed. When they finally emerged, Khaled's face looked hollow, drained of color, drained of spirit, drained of hope. He did not speak immediately. He simply walked past me toward our quarters. When I touched his arm gently, he whispered, "Later, please." My heart sank. Later came at night. He sat on the floor beside the bed, leaning against the frame as though he no longer had the energy to hold himself upright. "Khaled," I finally said. "What did he say to you?" He let out a slow, heavy breath. "Everything. Things that no father-in-law should ever discuss with a son-in-law. Things about money, about who controls what, about whose voice matters, about who owns which part of this marriage." My stomach tightened. He told me, Khaled continued, "that although you are my wife, I must seek his approval for every decision. Every change. Every move in this house. Even the number of guards around you." He said that. I whispered, though part of me was not surprised. "He made it very clear," Khaled said, rubbing his forehead, "that your life is not mine to protect. It is his to command." His voice cracked at the last words. I felt something inside me tremble, some mix of anger, grief, and exhaustion. "So even after marriage," I said bitterly, "I am still his possession." Khaled reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. You are not an object, Lalwa. But he's determined to make us live as if you are. That night, we did not speak more. He slept restless and tense. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of walls that never belonged to me. Days turned into weeks. My father's presence wrapped itself around our marriage like a shadow that refused to leave. He summoned Khaled constantly. Sometimes twice a day. Sometimes more. He questioned him about everything. How often I slept. Who I spoke to. How much time I spent outside. Which servants attended to me. What I ate. How I felt. He even dictated when Khaled should travel, how much money he should spend, and which rooms he could renovate in the palace wing. The worst came when he casually declared, I will manage the household finances. You will give me all monthly records. Monthly records. Of our marriage. As though Khaled were not my husband but my father's assistant. Khaled obeyed, but every time he walked back to our room, his steps grew heavier. He was not the same man I once knew, confident, steady, self-assured. It was as if my father's control carved pieces out of him day by day. And with every piece taken from him, I felt something taken from me. Because a woman cannot breathe freely when the man she loves is suffocating beside her. I began to feel imprisoned. Not by walls or guards, but by expectations so deeply rooted in our culture that no one dared question them. To the outside world, our family was seen as honorable, respected, full of leadership and prestige. But inside the palace gates, inside those high golden walls, my life was shrinking. I lived between two men. A husband who loved me but felt powerless. A father who loved control more than he loved people. One afternoon, I overheard something that shattered the tiny fragment of hope I had been holding on to. I was walking toward the inner courtyard when I heard my father's voice from his office. The door was slightly open, and inside, I saw him speaking to Khaled with his back turned. My breath caught when I heard the words. You will take my second daughter into your home. My mind froze. He didn't specify which sister, he didn't need to. The idea itself was enough to sink my heart into the marble floor. My body went cold. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. Khaled sounded horrified. Sir, please, that is not. This is not a request, my father interrupted sharply. It is an expectation. Expectation. As if forcing my husband to take another daughter. Another life, another soul, was simply a household duty. Your marriage to Lalwa placed you in our family, my father continued. You will follow our customs. Customs. That word again. A shield used to justify pain. Khaled tried to reason with him. Sheikh Abdul Rahman. I love your daughter. I cannot hurt her like this. My father turned slowly, his face stern, his authority towering. You do not speak of heart or choice in this house. You speak of obedience. Something inside me cracked. Not gently. Not softly. But violently, like glass breaking under too much pressure. I could not stay silent. I pushed the door open and stepped in. Both men turned toward me. Khaled's eyes widened, filled with worry. My father's gaze hardened. Father, I said, my voice trembling but firm. You cannot do this. You cannot force him to take another daughter. His expression did not change. He looked at me the way a ruler looks at a subject, measured, evaluating, emotionless. Lalwa, he said in a calm, cold tone, you forget your place. No, I whispered, shaking. You forget that I am human. The room fell silent. He stepped toward me slowly, each step echoing across the marble. When you speak this way, he said, you sound immature. You sound ungrateful. You sound like someone who thinks feelings matter more than legacy. Tears blurred my vision. I swallowed hard. And what about my marriage? My heart? My dignity? Your dignity, he said, comes from honoring your family's structure, not defying it. My breath broke. Khaled whispered, "Please, don't speak to her this way." My father turned sharply toward him. "You will not interrupt me." Then he looked back at me, lowering his voice dangerously. "You belong to this house. You follow our rules. You are not free to decide what is right." Those words pierced me deeper than any wound I had ever carried. I felt myself trembling. Not in fear, but in awakening. Something inside me rose. Something fierce. Something tired of chains. Something searching for a truth beyond this endless cycle of control. I stepped back, my voice barely steady. "I cannot live like this." "You will," he replied. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I won't." That was the moment something changed inside me. The moment my spirit reached its breaking point. The moment I realized that if I remained silent, I would lose myself entirely. The moment I understood that the life I was living was not life at all. It was in that moment, standing between the pressure of culture and the weight of fear, that a quiet voice inside my heart whispered, "There must be another way. There must be a truth beyond this. There must be someone who sees you. Someone who could save me." I didn't know him yet. I didn't understand what that whisper meant. But I felt something awaken, something beginning to guide me out of the darkness I had lived in all my life. This was the beginning of my transformation. The beginning of me searching, desperately, for a freedom I had never known. And soon, my path would lead me toward a light stronger than any power my father held. A light that would change everything. A light that had been waiting for me all along. After that confrontation with my father, something inside me refused to return to silence. It wasn't a sudden strength, no, it was more like a small flame in a dim room. Fragile, flickering, and easily crushed, yet warm enough to remind me that darkness wasn't the only thing that existed. For the first time in my life, I questioned everything I had been taught about obedience, honor, and even faith. I had grown up in a home filled with religious teachings. I memorized verses before I learned to write my own name. I prayed 5 times a day because it was expected of me. I fasted, recited, obeyed. But never in all those years did I feel seen by the God I prayed to. Never once did I feel comfort during my tears. Never once did the prayers in my childhood lighten the weight on my chest. Now that my life had reached its breaking point, I found myself asking, quietly, secretly, fearfully, who is God really? Does he hear me? Does he care about me? Does he exist beyond the rules written for me? These questions frightened me more than my father's voice, more than cultural pressure, more even than the consequences I knew could come if anyone discovered my thoughts. Because in Kuwait, especially in a family like mine, questioning faith was not a mistake. It was a crime. Yet the questions would not stop. They followed me into every room of the palace. They hovered above me when I tried to sleep. They whispered into my heart when I stood in the courtyard at dusk staring at the horizon. One night, unable to bear the weight of confusion, I did something reckless. I opened my laptop. The same laptop that the royal security team monitored. The same laptop that my father insisted must remain in the palace office at all times unless escorted. But that night, when everyone was asleep, I tiptoed into the office barefoot, the marble floor cool beneath my feet, my heart beating as loudly as if a drum were pressed against my chest. I unlocked the laptop, my hands trembling. And I typed something I never imagined I would type. Why do Muslims leave Islam? I expected articles written by scholars, but instead something else appeared. Faces. Videos. People speaking with raw honesty. Former Muslims. Some from the Gulf, some from Europe, some from Africa, sharing stories about encountering Jesus, feeling his love, hearing his voice, then finding peace they had never experienced before. At first, I stared at the screen, frozen. If anyone walked in, I could be punished. Even killed. Royal families do not tolerate doubt, especially doubt that leads toward Christianity. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a long moment. Then I clicked. The first testimony was of a young woman from a strict home. She spoke softly, tears in her eyes, saying, "I never knew God loved me until He found me. I felt the air leave my lungs." Loved me? That phrase, that feeling, had never been part of my religion. God was spoken of with distance, power, judgment, never tenderness. She continued, "I prayed one night, 'God, if you are real, show me the way.' And He answered." My hand covered my mouth. Her words pierced my heart because they were the exact words my soul had been trying to whisper but feared to speak. I closed the video quickly, afraid that even listening to such a thing was forbidden. But something inside me had awakened. A curiosity deeper than fear. A longing stronger than my father's control. The next night I returned. I searched again. And again. I watched testimonies from men who had found hope after years of violence. Women who found healing after oppression. People who described Jesus not as a distant prophet, but as a living Savior whose presence brought peace into their brokenness. Peace. The very thing my life lacked. Some stories felt like mirrors of my own pain, though the details differed. People oppressed by family. People suffocated by tradition. People forced into marriages. People treated as objects. People who felt unseen. People who cried in secret. And every time they described the moment they encountered Jesus as gentle, personal, full of compassion. Compassion, another word I had never associated with God before. But what frightened me most was how naturally their words entered my heart, as though I had been waiting for them my entire life. I kept watching more videos, each time closing the browser history, clearing records, hiding evidence. If I got caught, I knew exactly what would happen. A woman from a royal family converting. It would be treated as betrayal. An embarrassment. An attack on honor. I could be imprisoned. I could be silenced. I could disappear. Still, I kept searching. Because the more I learned, the more I felt something new, a soft, steady pull in my heart. A pull toward a kind of hope I had never known. One night, after watching a man describe how Jesus spoke to him through a dream, I felt tears sliding down my face before I even realized I was crying. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to breathe. For the first time in my life, I prayed a prayer that did not come from memorization, or duty, or fear. I whispered it from my heart. God, if you are real. If you see me. If you hear me. If you care that I'm breaking. Show me. My voice cracked. My heart ached. I don't know who you are. I don't know what is true. I just know I cannot survive like this anymore. Please, guide me. When I opened my eyes, the room was quiet. The palace was silent. The sky outside my window was dark and still. But my heart felt different. Not healed. Not free. But touched. Like a small light had been placed inside me. Not bright enough to change everything yet, but strong enough to keep me moving. Still, I knew I had to be careful. So I bought a tiny digital storage device, one no larger than my thumb. I hid it inside the lining of my abaya. On it, I saved everything. Testimonies, teachings, verses about love and compassion, recordings of people speaking about meeting Jesus. Every time I plugged it in, my pulse raced, knowing that discovery could mean the end of my life. But I couldn't stop. Because for the first time ever, I felt seen. And something inside me whispered softly, "Keep searching. You are not alone. A greater truth is calling you." I didn't know it yet, but I was walking toward a turning point that would change the course of my life forever. A turning point that would reveal a love stronger than fear. A turning point that would bring me face to face with the one who had been calling me since childhood. The one who would save me from everything that had ever held me captive. And that moment was coming soon. That night, I could no longer hold myself together. I paced my room in silence, my heart heavy, my thoughts tangled with fear and exhaustion. Every breath felt like it dragged 100 chains with it. Finally, my knees gave way beneath me, and I collapsed onto the cold floor. I cried, truly cried, like I had never allowed myself to before. "God, I can't do this anymore," I whispered between sobs. "Please, help me." The room went still. Then, without warning, a soft light appeared in the darkness. At first I thought it was just my tears blurring my sight, but the glow grew brighter, warmer, alive. The walls of my room faded away. Everything around me shifted into a bright, white light. And then I saw him. A figure standing before me, radiant, gentle, powerful. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only stare as his presence filled me with a warmth I had never felt in my life. It was Jesus. I covered my face with my hands, overwhelmed by a feeling I didn't have words for. He stepped closer, and when he spoke, his voice wrapped around my heart like healing. "You are my daughter." I felt something inside me break, something heavy, something ancient. Tears poured down my face. Then he said, "I came to set the captives free." In an instant, memories flashed through my mind. The palace walls that felt like cages. The forced marriages. The endless expectations. The silence I learned to live inside. His words touched wounds I had carried alone for years. I reached out trembling, and as his light grew even brighter, everything around me dissolved into peace, pure, overwhelming peace. I woke up suddenly, gasping, my heart racing. But instead of fear, I felt joy. Warm tears streamed down my cheeks, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. I placed my hand over my chest. For the first time in my life, it wasn't tight. It wasn't heavy. It was still, calm. A peace I had never known filled me, resting inside me like a quiet, steady flame. "Jesus," I whispered into the darkness, my voice trembling. "You saw me. You really saw me." And as I sat there, hugging my knees to my chest, I felt that same peace settle over me again, gentle, comforting, real. For the first time ever, I wasn't afraid. I knew I was no longer alone. From the moment I woke up after the vision, something inside me had changed so deeply that I couldn't hide it, even if I tried. I moved through the palace halls with a calmness that felt foreign, almost miraculous. The fear that once clung to me like a shadow no longer anchored my steps. My husband noticed it almost immediately. He studied me with cautious eyes, as though he was trying to understand a language he had never heard before. At first, he asked gentle questions. Was I feeling well? Had something happened? Was I hiding some terrible truth? But I only smiled softly, and the more he watched me, the more his confusion turned into wonder. For the first time since our marriage began, he saw a peace in me that even I could not fully explain. Eventually, one evening when the palace had gone quiet, he approached me with a seriousness that made my heart tremble. "You look different," he said. "Not afraid. Not sad. What changed? His voice wasn't demanding. It was searching. I took a slow breath, knowing the danger of what I was about to say, yet feeling a courage rise within me that no tradition or threat could silence. I told him that I had found love, real love, a love that didn't come from men, power, or culture. I didn't speak in arguments or doctrines. I spoke in the simple truth of what I had experienced. I told him about the peace that had settled inside me, about the freedom I felt for the first time, about a presence that filled me the night I cried out in desperation. I didn't mention the name of Jesus immediately. I needed him to hear my heart before he heard the words that could cost us our lives. But he listened. He listened the way a thirsty man drinks water. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. When I finally whispered the name Jesus, his eyes widened, not in anger, but in shock. I expected fear. I expected denial. Instead, he asked gently, "You truly believe he came to you?" I nodded, and something inside him seemed to shift right in front of me. He didn't run. He didn't rebuke me. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, he found me on the balcony and asked if he could see what I had been reading in secret. I hesitated, terrified of what might happen if my digital Bible was discovered, yet something told me to trust him. I handed him the small device I had hidden for weeks, and I watched as his fingers trembled when the words of the New Testament appeared on the screen. For several nights afterward, he returned to it in silence. He read slowly, cautiously, as though every verse carried a weight he didn't know how to hold. I never pressured him, I only prayed silently beside him. He didn't speak about what he was feeling, but I saw the questions forming behind his eyes. I saw the internal battle. The fear of our culture, the loyalty to my father, the pressure of his family and society, all clashing with the quiet truth he was discovering. Each passing day I felt him drawing closer to the same peace that had transformed me. Then one night, just before dawn, he shook me awake with trembling hands. His breathing was unsteady, his face pale yet strangely bright. "I saw him," he whispered. "In a dream. I saw him." My heart pounded as he described how Jesus appeared to him surrounded by a soft light, calling him by name, telling him not to be afraid, telling him that the truth he was searching for would set him free. Tears filled his eyes as he tried to put words to something too sacred to fully describe. For the first time since our marriage, I saw raw vulnerability in him, a man torn between the chains he was born into and the freedom being offered to him. That moment became a turning point neither of us expected. He sat beside me, his hands shaking, and said with a conviction I had never heard from him before, "I can't live under your father's control anymore. Not like this. Not after what I saw." His voice cracked as he admitted how the pressure, manipulation, and fear had stripped him of his dignity. He confessed how exhausted he was pretending everything was normal, how deeply he hated the twisted agreement that bound our marriage to my father's authority. For years he had been too afraid to confront the man who could destroy his political future, his reputation, even his life. But now something had awakened inside him, something stronger than fear. As he spoke, I realized the truth: he had been a prisoner too, just like me. And now the same light that had broken my chains had begun to break his. In that quiet moment before sunrise, with the faint glow of morning touching the curtains, he made a promise, not to me, but to himself. He said he would no longer bow to the darkness that ruled our lives. He said he would protect me, even if it cost him everything. And when he held my hands in his, I felt the beginning of a new chapter, a dangerous one, but one filled with hope. He wasn't just my husband anymore. He had become a man awakened, a man touched by the same love that had rescued me. And I knew then that the shift in my father's power did not happen all at once. It was slow, almost invisible in the beginning, like the subtle dimming of a great lantern that had always burned too brightly. For decades, he had been a dominant force in Kuwait's political circles, respected, feared, and obeyed without question. But as the months passed, whispers reached the palace about rivals rising in influence, about new alliances forming that did not bow to his authority. At first, he dismissed them with the arrogant confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. But I watched him closely. The confidence that once carried him began to crack, the world he had tightly controlled was slipping through his fingers. My husband noticed it too. The demands, the surveillance, the endless commands he once threw at us with absolute certainty grew less frequent, yet somehow more desperate. I sensed frustration in his voice, the heaviness in his steps. The iron fist of my childhood father no longer struck the way it used to. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in him, fear not of God, not of judgment, but of losing the throne he had built inside his own mind. It was during this vulnerable shift that my husband approached me one night and said, "We need to speak to him, together." Those words made my heart race. Confronting my father had always been unthinkable, but now something in me stirred with courage. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps the chains needed to be challenged at their source. We waited for the right moment, choosing an evening when he had returned from a tense political meeting. He seemed exhausted, drained of the strength he once used to intimidate anyone in his path. When we entered his private majlis, he looked up at us sharply, as though preparing for a battle he wasn't sure he could win. My hands trembled as I spoke, but my voice remained steady. I told him, respectfully, carefully, that the path he had forced upon us was breaking our souls. I told him that his need for control had destroyed our marriage, our peace, and the honor he claimed to protect. My husband stood beside me, strong and resolute, and spoke with courage I had never heard from him before. He told my father that a family built on fear was not a family at all. My father erupted. Rage poured out of him like a storm he had kept bottled for years. His voice thundered through the room, accusing us of betrayal, disrespect, and weakness. He reminded us of traditions, of royal bloodlines, of duties tied to our ancestry. He pounded his fist on the table, his face turning red with fury. For a moment, I feared he would call in the guards. But even in his anger, I sensed something different. His words wavered, his breath quickened, his strength faltered. He was a king whose kingdom was crumbling, a ruler whose people were no longer willing to bow. When we left the room, my heart felt heavy, not with fear, but with sorrow. I had seen a side of my father that I didn't know existed, a wounded man, terrified of losing the only identity he had ever known. That night, neither my husband nor I slept. The confrontation had left the air thick with tension, yet there was something else beneath it, a sense that something greater was shifting in the unseen. Then came the night that changed everything. It was past midnight when I heard a sound coming from my father's private chamber. At first, I thought it was another angry outburst, but as I approached the door, I sensed something different, something trembling, something desperate. I hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. My father, the man who had ruled our lives with an iron hand, was on his knees. His entire body shook as though a great weight was crushing him from the inside. His face was pale, drenched in sweat, and his eyes were wide with terror. He looked up at me, and there was no arrogance, no pride, no authority left in him. In a trembling voice, he whispered, "I saw him." His words stunned me. He clutched his chest as he described a bright figure standing before him in a dream, radiant, powerful, yet overflowing with compassion. He called me, my father said, tears spilling down his face. He called me to turn away from everything I have done. He said there is still mercy, even for me. Hearing those words from the man who once believed himself untouchable shook me to my core. Jesus had entered the darkness of his heart, the very darkness that had enslaved us for years. My husband entered the room moments later, and the three of us stood in a silence so heavy, it felt sacred. My father's hands covered his face as he began to sob, a sound I had never heard from him in my entire life. He wept for the years he had controlled us, for the harm he had justified in the name of honor, for the pride that had ruled him like a tyrant. Seeing him cry was like watching a mountain crumble into sand. He wasn't the king of our home anymore. He was just a man, broken, frightened, and desperately in need of redemption. I knelt beside him, hesitating before I touched his shoulder. When he didn't pull away, I whispered the same prayer I once whispered for myself: God, if this is truly you, heal him. The words felt fragile, yet powerful. My father's breaths came in sharp, shaky waves, and then suddenly he collapsed forward, his forehead touching the floor as his body convulsed with grief. But it wasn't just grief, something inside him was breaking free, something that had been chained for a lifetime. When he finally lifted his head, his face was soaked with tears, and his voice came out in a whisper barely louder than the crackling of the night air. "Forgive me," he said. "Both of you, forgive me." In that moment, I no longer saw the man who had imprisoned my childhood or tormented my marriage. I saw a father finally touched by the same mercy that had come to me and my husband. His heart had softened. A door had opened. And for the first time, the darkness that ruled our family began to shatter. The fall of his power became the rise of his humanity and the beginning of his redemption. The morning after my father's breakdown felt strangely quiet, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. I woke with a sense of anticipation, unsure of what the new day would bring. When I stepped into the corridor outside my room, I found my father standing there, waiting for me. His posture was not rigid or commanding like before. Instead, he looked small, almost fragile, with eyes swollen from the night's tears. For a moment, we simply stood facing each other. Father and daughter, a ruler and prisoner, two souls wounded by the same darkness. Then he lowered his head and whispered the words I had waited my entire life to hear: "My daughter. I apologize. For everything. For every wound. For every chain." His voice broke, and with it, something in my heart broke open too. I didn't know how to respond at first. The apology was so unexpected, so heavy with sincerity, that my body trembled. All my life I had begged silently for his affection, for even a hint of tenderness. Now, here he was, stripped of power, stripped of pride, offering me a raw and vulnerable confession. I felt tears spill down my cheeks, not from bitterness, but from relief. I placed my hand on his arm, a gesture I had never dared before, and told him I forgave him. Truly, completely. The weight I had carried since childhood began to fall away like dust in the wind. In that moment, I realized forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was freedom. My husband joined us shortly afterward, and for the first time, I saw my father look at him without dominance or expectation. He didn't speak like a ruler, but like a man seeking forgiveness. He told my husband that he was released from the political alliance, released from the marriage agreement, released from every form of control that had bound him. My husband's eyes filled with tears, and I watched as the chains that once held him so tightly dissolved in an instant. He took a deep breath, perhaps the first free breath of his life, and nodded with gratitude rather than fear. The three of us stood in silence, aware that we were witnessing a miracle unfolding in real time. Yet with my father's transformation came a difficult reality. His political rivals were already circling like hawks. The palace staff sensed weakness, alliances were shifting, and whispers of betrayal began to echo through the halls. We knew we could not stay in Kuwait, not as new believers, not as a family that had broken the ancient patterns of royal dominance, and certainly not as people now spiritually awakened in a nation where such awakening could cost us our lives. So, in the shadows of the night, with only a few trusted individuals aware, we made arrangements to leave the country quietly. The escape was tense and heartbreaking. Though the palace had been a golden prison, it was still my home, the place where I had learned to walk, where I had whispered countless prayers into my pillow, where I had spent years longing for freedom. Now I was walking away from it all with nothing but a small bag, my husband's hand in mine, and my father trailing behind us with the humility of a man blessed with a second chance. We boarded a discreet flight to a Christian-majority country, one that granted asylum to those fleeing religious persecution. As the plane lifted off the runway, I looked through the window at the lights of the city I had once thought would define me forever. Instead of sadness, I felt peace. When we landed and were escorted to a safe location, the reality of our new life began to sink in. There were no guards, no royal protocols, no suffocating expectations. My husband and I sat on a simple couch, holding hands, marveling at the silence that wasn't controlled or monitored. My father sat across from us, staring at his hands, overwhelmed by the freedom he had never known he needed. In that small, humble room, thousands of miles away from where our story began, something incredible happened. The three of us prayed together openly, without fear. My father's voice, once loud and commanding, was now soft as he surrendered his life to Christ. My husband did the same, tears streaming down his face. And I felt joy rise inside me so pure that it made my whole body tremble. We spent the following days adjusting to our new life. There were challenges, of course, everything was unfamiliar, and we were like newborns learning how to breathe again. But for the first time, I felt my identity forming from within instead of being forced upon me. I was no longer a daughter shaped by royal expectations, no longer a wife trapped in a political alliance, no longer a prisoner of the traditions that had suffocated me. I was simply a woman loved by God, guided by grace, and surrounded by two men who had finally found the light that once felt unreachable. My father began attending church with us quietly, often sitting at the back, absorbing every word like a man rebuilding the foundation of his soul. My husband grew stronger each day, unburdened and steady, no longer torn between loyalty and truth. And I, after years of hiding my tears, burying my pain, and living behind a mask of royal perfection, finally began to breathe freely. Freedom wasn't just a place. Freedom was the presence of Christ living inside me, guiding every step, healing every scar. As I say this, I no longer tremble with fear of what my family or country might think. I no longer carry the weight of shame or secrecy. I am free, truly free. And the daughter who once cried in golden chambers now walks in a new identity, built not on titles or traditions, but on love, grace, and truth. Christ didn't just save me. He saved all three of us. And in this freedom, I finally discovered who I was always meant to be. When the camera turns toward me, there is no crown on my head, no jewels on my hands, no palace behind me. It is just me, finally myself, finally unmasked, finally free. For a moment, I can hear my own heartbeat, steady and calm, carrying a peace I once believed I would never taste. I look straight into the lens, knowing my words may reach places I will never step into, knowing they may touch hearts still living behind walls I once knew too well. I breathe deeply, and then I begin to speak. Not as a royal daughter, not as a political symbol, but as a woman who has been rescued. I tell the world that my life looked perfect from the outside, wrapped in gold, guarded by soldiers, shaped by traditions people never dared to question. But inside, I lived in a silent prison, one no one could see. A prison made of fear, control, and expectations that crushed my voice until I no longer recognized it. I tell them I thought my story was already written for me, that my destiny was sealed by my bloodline, that I had no right to dream of freedom. But I was wrong. One night, in the deepest darkness of my life, Jesus stepped into my prison and opened the door. Not with force, not with fear, but with love so powerful it broke every chain I carried. I confess that I didn't find him because I was brave. I found him because I was desperate. I searched in secret, whispering prayers I was afraid anyone would hear. But he had me. He came to me. He called me his daughter. And in that moment, the walls I had lived behind for years began to crumble. I tell those watching that freedom is not just the absence of fear, it is the presence of truth. It is the courage to stand, even when your whole life tries to sit you down. It is the strength to choose life when everything around you pushes you toward silence. I speak to the ones who are still suffering in hidden places, the women who cry behind closed doors, the men who feel chained by duty, the children who believe they are invisible. I tell them that no prison is too strong, no darkness too deep, no pain too old for God to reach. I tell them that I thought escape was impossible, but now I know that the greatest freedom does not come from running away, it comes from being transformed from the inside. I look into the camera one last time, and with a voice steady with conviction, I say, if you are hurting, if you are afraid, if you feel alone, I want you to know this: Jesus came into my prison and opened the door. And he can open yours too. My eyes fill with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the God who saw me when I was hidden, who called me when I was lost, who healed me when I was broken. The message ends not with my story, but with an invitation. A promise that hope is real, that salvation is near, and that courage is born the moment someone realizes they are loved by the one who never abandons. As the screen fades, I whisper a final prayer that every person watching will feel the same light that saved me. My testimony is no longer a secret. It is a beacon for anyone still waiting to be free.